Welcome to the Miller Center's pre-State of the Union conversation done in partnership with FedNet. I'm Bill Antholis, I'm the director of the Miller Center, and I'm here with three, not just terrific, but three of my leading colleagues and three of our leading experts here at the Miller Center. Barbara Perry, who's the director of presidential studies and the co-director of our presidential oral history program. Steve Mull, a senior fellow with the Miller Center, but more importantly to the university, the vice provost for global affairs at the University of Virginia. And finally, Jennifer Lawless, another senior fellow at the Miller Center, but the chair of the politics department here at UVA. What we thought we would do is talk about State of the Unions, past, present, and future. Where did it come from? Where are we? And where are we going with this? And so I'll start with our lead presidential historian. How did we get this thing? And where did it come from, Barbara?
Right. Well, as with so many things from our really old Constitution, it obviously evolves over time, but I will turn to the Constitution itself, where it says in Article 2, Section 3, that the President, quote, shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient.
From time to time?
Doesn't even say every year. So it obviously evolves to what we know now as the State of the Union address that presidents typically give in person, usually in January or February.
And did George Washington do it in person?
He did. At the time, then capital was in New York, and so he's the first president and the first one to give a message to Congress that's considered to be following the Constitution. And then our very own Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the University of Virginia, decided that that seemed too monarchical to him because he felt like it was the monarch, the King of England, going before Parliament, sitting on the throne and giving a message to Parliament. And of course, up until very recently, Queen Elizabeth would do that same thing, complete with the gown and the people holding on to the robes in the back and that sort of thing. So he decided that was too monarchical. He would just send a written report.
Jen, have any of your students said that class participation shouldn't count because Jefferson just mailed it in?
No, but I feel like anybody that watches this is now going to use that as a regular excuse.
So Jefferson stops going. And how did it start up again, that presidents started going back in front of Congress?
Right, it starts back up with Woodrow Wilson, another UVA connection. Came here to law school for a little bit before he went on to be our PhD, political scientist president. So he decided, and not, I think coincidentally, we now in this business view that as the rhetorical presidency's beginning, where he thought, maybe because he had a PhD in political science, that this was a way that presidents could teach people and lead them through giving addresses and giving statements, and he had to do this anyway. So in 1913 he goes in person, and with only a few exceptions for a presidential illness, FDR, for example, as his health was declining and the war was raging in 44 and 45. But almost every president since then has gone in person, usually in the dead of winter after the holidays, with a new Congress if there's been a midterm election or a presidential election.
And do you have favorites, Barbara, looking back in history?
Favorites? One that always comes to mind to me is the 1995 Bill Clinton address, because it is just after he's lost the House of Representatives in the Newt Gingrich revolution of the 94 midterms. And I happened to be a fellow at the Supreme Court that year. And I'll always remember coming in, first of all, the day after that election and that revolution. And as Oliver Wendell Holmes used to say, the court is at the center of the storm, but there's this calmness because it is not in the electoral system as such. And so I walked in the day after that 94 election. Everything looked the same as when I had left on election day. But I knew that just across the street there had been this turmoil. And then for Bill Clinton to give that address in 95, which I thought, if you don't mind my saying so, sort of droned on for, it seemed like way more than an hour. And for the first time, I just kept thinking, gosh, it's just this laundry list, and there's no Ich bin ein Berliner moment, or ask not what you're, the only thing we have to fear itself, sort of the inaugural rhetoric. But then a few days later, I read that the American people had listened in and thought it was a really good speech. So I always go back to that maybe that's the model, and presidents tend to follow that. It seems in some ways to work for them.
Mm-hmm. Steve, memorable foreign policy speeches in political history?
I think foreign policy generally plays a backbench role in most State of the Union addresses, which tend to focus on the president's legislative priorities for the coming year. But when foreign policy does feature, it usually is for pretty important reasons. Usually most presidents, when they touch on foreign policy, it's for three purposes. One, generally speaking, throughout most of our history, there's been general unanimity behind what America's foreign interests abroad are. So anytime a president can be the face of something that unites the country, it's something that he's going to seize because it's one of those big applause moments. People can rise to their feet in defense of our interests. That's not always the case lately. Foreign policy over the years has generally become more partisan in nature, but whenever there's unity, they will seize that. Two is to signal adversaries that don't mess with us. We're going to defend our core interests. Those are also great applause lines, but having served overseas during many State of the Union, people pay attention. And if we are sending a hardline message to an adversary, that's always a very effective place to do it. And third, it's a good opportunity for the president to set the stage for any new sacrifices he may be asking of the American people, to lay the philosophical, the strategic foundation for a new initiative that he might want to take. And looking at those three things, I think one of the most important foreign policy State of the Unions over the years was Franklin Roosevelt's For Freedom speech in January of 1941, where he was facing substantial opposition from a rising isolationist movement, the America First movement, who wanted to stay way clear of the war in Europe. He laid out a very eloquent foundation for support for the growing partnership with the British and fighting the Germans, but then also to lay out a sweeping philosophical approach to American foreign policy of the four freedoms, that we would protect freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those are key points that later became major pillars of U.S. foreign policy throughout the Second World War and beyond. So it was quite important.
Mm-hmm. Jen, big domestic things in history that strike out at you, either substance or the nature of the partisan nature of this and how it's evolved?
Well, as far as substance is concerned, I think a lot of people will remember Bill Clinton waving the national health card that was going to usher in national health care for all Americans. It's been decades and we're still not quite there. So it didn't work out, but symbolically it demonstrated an opportunity to show the American people literally what he planned to do. As far as polarization is concerned, though...
Interestingly, though, he also had a big speech where he declared the end of the era of the big government. So on the one hand doing that, on the other hand, that there are bounds to how much the federal government can do.
Certainly, and what they're going to use their power to do,
yeah.
Right? So to say that healthcare is something that they can do is a lot different than saying that, they're going to regulate Wall Street in a very, very concrete way. In terms of polarization, though, there have been several moments over time that I think highlight opportunities to mitigate polarization and highlight the fact that that's not going to happen. So the first time that Nancy Pelosi was up there after the Democrats won back the House in the 2006 elections, George Bush was very, very glowing and very proud to be able to introduce the first female Speaker of the House. And she got substantial applause, and then there was nothing for the rest of that speech that indicated that the Democrats and the Republicans were going to work together, right? So there was this recognition that, we achieved something, but that's where it ends. Another example is after Gabby Giffords was shot, and at that State of the Union address, there was the sense that the different delegations were going to sit together, the states were going to sit together rather than in a partisan way. Again, they were literally sitting together, but they were not clapping together, and you just saw different groups within each state's delegation stand up. And then there was my personal favorite, which was date night at the State of the Union, where there was the suggestion that every Democrat bring a Republican, every Republican bring a Democrat. And so they sit in pairs to highlight again that they're willing to work together. All we saw was a willingness to sit next to each other. There was nothing beyond that. So, I think we're now back to the Democrats on one side, the Republicans on the other, and at least viewers know where to look.
Well, the mentioning of the viewers and know where to look, there is something to the idea that when the president goes through what invariably becomes a bit of a laundry list, they're signaling to audiences, the opposition party is signaling to audiences where they can work and where they can't work by when they stand up together as one or where they let the president's party stand up. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's just a thing. I mean, and frankly, when both sides stand, they're standing over statements that are like, America is a leading power. Okay, great, we're clapping, everybody's standing and applauding that. What does that even mean, right? When it gets to any action item, it's hard to come up with even one or two times during what has become an hour-and-a-half long speech for Democrats and Republicans to get behind the president and say, yes, we're going to make this happen. So when it comes to the legislative agenda, we really see very little of that. Sometimes when you're talking about foreign policy, sometimes when you're talking about adversaries or the way that the United States has to unite behind, at least in the last couple of years, Ukraine, you might see some general sense of support. But when it comes to a domestic policy agenda, you can't even count on one hand. There are basically no times where everybody's going to stand up.
We will get to the current speech, particularly given, as you mentioned, Ukraine, and I'm sure that that'll be central. But Steve, I do want to go back to a more recent president than FDR, one where you were serving, and president used the State of the Union address in a way that sort of galvanized international attention, and that's the Bush axis of evil speech. So tell us a little bit about the speech and where you were and how that was received where you were.
Well, it was one of the most important foreign policy speeches. It's right up there with the Four Freedoms speech of Roosevelt, but for different reasons. This was the first joint session of Congress, first State of the Union after the 9/11 attacks. And President Bush decided to use that as an opportunity to lay out a new foundation for American foreign policy in the age of terror. The global war on terrorism, the GWAT, became the guiding mantra for all U.S. foreign policy wherever we worked. I was in Indonesia at the time.
And I should have mentioned at the outset, Steve, before coming to UVA, finished a long career in government as a career foreign service officer, as Undersecretary for Political Affairs, but also served as ambassador to Poland after a series of other important State Department positions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to Indonesia before 9/11. I was the deputy chief of mission there. And our interests in Indonesia were quite varied at the time, focused on development, support for democracy, growth for civil society. And after 9/11, and particularly after the 2002 State of the Union, the most important interest that for the U.S. and Indonesia became making sure the Indonesians would support us in this global war on terrorism.
If I remember correctly, it has one of, if not the largest Muslim population in the world.
It's the largest Muslim country in the world. So that speech had a dramatic impact on my day-to-day work and actually occasioned rising protests against American policy. Most Indonesian political figures, either opportunistically or sincerely, believed that this was a war on Islam, that they tried to take advantage. So very quickly, we became the target of massive demonstrations regularly that ended up resulting in a major drawdown of our embassy there because of security reasons. That was also an important speech for the axis of evil that you mentioned, in which the president identified Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as members of an axis of evil. In an earlier draft of the speech, it was supposed to be an axis of hatred. They decided evil was starker and put things in clearer black and white terms. Well, of course, once you call an adversary evil, it makes it really hard to conduct diplomacy with them. Who wants to do a deal with the devil? Not very many people. And so, for example, right at around that time, the U.S. was engaging in unprecedented diplomatic engagement behind the scenes with Iran to try to figure out what the next government of Afghanistan would look like. Colleagues of mine, such as James Dobbins, Ryan Crocker, who later became ambassador to Iraq and then Afghanistan, was basically their diplomatic efforts were shut down after we publicly identified Iran as a member of the axis of evil. So it had a huge impact and dramatically shifted the course of U.S.-Iranian relations into even more adversarial directions.
Let me just pause on that for a second. Having worked in the government, both at the State Department and the White House, I'm now remembering, because you said that there's a clearance process of sorts for these speeches. When you were Undersecretary of State of Political Affairs, did you get to see the State of the Union before it was delivered? Or was that done at the most senior level?
That was, no, what would happen was at the State Department, every cabinet department gets solicited for input, things they'd like to see mentioned in the State of the Union a month or two beforehand. And then that goes into a black box in the White House, and the members of the cabinet typically get the final draft about 24 hours before delivery, just to make sure there's nothing there that's a mistake or that they don't want, but there's not a lot of turnaround time to do that. One of the most famous examples was in the Bush State of the Union a year later in 2003. When he identified, it turned out incorrectly, that Iraq was trying to buy uranium from Niger, which later turned out not to be true.
The yellow cake comment, right?
Yes, that's right. And that made it into the final draft, even though George Tenet, the director of the CIA, later said, oops, we shouldn't have allowed that to get in there. So the clearance process doesn't always work.
Barbara, one last question for history, and then we'll take a short break and talk about State of the Union's present. But another thing developed over time, the idea of putting people up in the gallery and talking about them. How did that come about, and do you have particular memories about that, of ones that were particularly meaningful or memorable?
Sure. The master of the stage, the former actor Ronald Reagan, knowing that this would draw attention and emotion and some unity. If you put someone up in the gallery, particularly sitting with or next to the First Lady, and it's someone who's heroic, typically both parties will clap for that person. So it begins in '82 with the famous hero Lenny Skutnik. And folks who remember back to that time, a terrible airplane accident happened in Washington, where in January, with snow and ice coming down, an Air Florida plane takes off from what is now Reagan National Airport, was then National Airport, and because of the ice and snow on the wing, it can't get enough altitude, and it crashes into the Potomac River and crashes into one of the bridges over the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. to Northern Virginia. And I'll never forget watching that live on television. And people were trying to escape from the plane, but they were escaping into icy Potomac River waters. And one Lenny Skutnik, who was a federal bureaucrat, fairly low-level federal bureaucrat, along with many other bystanders, had gathered along the shores of the Potomac. And he began to see these people bobbing up and struggling. A helicopter had come out over the river, and it dropped a line to try to get people to hold on, and they would raise them up to safety. And one of the flight attendants was injured and so weak she couldn't maintain her hold. And Lenny Skutnik jumped fully clothed into this icy Potomac, swam out to the middle of the river, saved her in sort of a lifeguard's fireman carry, and swept her, swam with her back to the shore. So the people who continue to come now as at the guest of the president are known as Lenny Skutniks. And it's always my favorite part of the speech, because it's always interesting to see which kinds of people strike the president or strike the first lady, as that would be somebody good. I'm sure advisors help with that too. So another favorite is during the Clinton years, Rosa Parks was brought in 1999. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, was brought in by Trump for the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And I think particularly last year, the bringing in of the Ukrainian ambassador from Ukraine to the U.S. And have her sit with Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, just as the start of the Ukraine war was really special. And that's part of that symbolism that Jen talks about as well.
Well, that's a great segue to our next segment. We'll get away from ghosts of State of the Union past, and we'll focus on ghosts of the State of the Union present. Welcome back to the Miller Center's pre-State of the Union conversation in partnership with FedNet. We've talked about ghosts of State of the Union past. Let's talk about ghosts of the present. And we'll back up the present a year or two. We're in the beginning of the third year of the Biden presidency. He's done one State of the Union and one address to a joint session of Congress, which you do after you've been inaugurated. Jen, help us set the current context. President Biden, on the one hand, lost one house of Congress, but had a pretty successful run in getting stuff passed, both in his own party and even bipartisan. So what's this going to feel like? Is it going to be divided or unifying?
Oh, it's going to be divided, but he's going to treat it as a victory lap, similar to what we saw after the 2022 elections. The expectations were that the Democrats were going to lose many, many seats in the House, and that the Senate was not a sure thing to hold. So not only did they pick up a Senate seat, but they really were able to maintain far more House seats than anybody expected. As a result, Kevin McCarthy has a very, very difficult time governing his own conference. And this renegade part of his party that's basically holding everything hostage, they didn't expect to have to contend with, because they were expecting a 20 or a 30 seat margin. So there's no question that Biden is going to walk in feeling quite empowered. He's no longer got unified government behind him, but this is way better than anybody expected. In addition, part of the reason that it's way better than anybody expected is because of these bipartisan successes. So the infrastructure bill was a real thing, and it was very, very successful, and it was bipartisan in both chambers, not by 1 or 2 votes. Similarly, the components of Build Back Better that he was able to pass did not garner Republican support in Congress, but it did garner quite a bit of Republican support in the population. And so the kinds of legislative victories that President Biden is going to be able to tout are popular with the American people. And what that means is that the Republicans in the chamber are going to have to decide how set against those victories they want to be, knowing that they're up for re-election in less than 2 years.
Mm-hmm. One quick follow-up there. How much do you expect the speech will be rattling off those past accomplishments, and how much will it be looking forward to what he wants to do in the next 2 years?
So it'll be a little of both. My sense is that the rattling off of the accomplishments will set the stage for how much more can still be done, and when we work together, what can happen. I think it's also an opportunity for Biden to demonstrate that he's willing to work with the Republicans. He's willing to get things done on behalf of the American people. And he's going to talk about, I'm sure, the debt ceiling and the fact that there need to be economic compromises that are struck. And he's going to have the upper hand on this because he has the accomplishments that he can tout, and he also is the one giving the speech. The thing that's unfortunate for the out party for the State of the Union is that they have to prepare a rebuttal speech in advance, having no idea what he's going to say or how to frame it. And so a lot of the time, you wind up rebutting things that didn't come up or with a frame that wasn't necessarily the most appropriate. So, I think he's going to go in there very empowered, touting the importance of bipartisanship, and basically letting the American people know that if additional accomplishments are not seen, it's because the Republicans served as obstructionists, not because he wasn't willing to extend an olive branch.
Steve, on the foreign policy side, we touched on in the first segment, Ukraine. Is that going to be the whole speech, or are there other big interesting challenges out there?
Well, again, going back to the original frame, that foreign policy is usually a good opportunity to display unity and consensus and American resolve on things. Ukraine, I think, will certainly be the top foreign policy issue in the speech, and he'll have to walk a fine line here. American support for Ukraine has led the world. We've led an alliance very effectively in providing an amazing degree of military support for Ukraine, but in the past few months, that's begun to crack a little bit. We've seen some of the Republicans start to question whether or not the United States should be continuing to provide this support. So he's going to have to walk a very narrow line of indicating that American resolve is strong. It's going to be for as long as Ukraine needs it until it successfully defends its territory, without playing into Republican rhetoric that this is the beginning of spending billions and billions and billions of dollars when there are many unmet needs here at home. So reassuring those who are skeptical about the war, which is still a small minority, but growing, while signaling to the world that American resolve is strong. So I think he'll be able to do it. He's done it quite well over the past year of the war, but it's going to become an increasingly difficult path to walk. China will also be an important theme. Here again, he's not going to want, that's one of the few areas of bipartisan agreement these days, is to be tough on China. And we see that actually quite surprisingly in the formation of the new select committee in the Congress to focus on China. And ironically, over the past couple of months, Chinese rhetoric has begun stepping back from the brink, trying to calm things down. And it will be interesting to see, does Biden try to play to that and signal that we're willing to engage more constructively? Or will he cling to this great unity that we're going to be tough on China? And frankly, the balloon that's
I was
now
going to
above
just ask, is he going to mention the
States.
spy balloon?
Tony Blinken has now postponed his trip that was supposed to be happening now. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to be seeing any new efforts towards détente with China. Mm-hmm. And what he will say about Taiwan will be very interesting. For most of the past several generations, American policy on Taiwan has been quite ambiguous. Will we defend Taiwan if China attacks or not? President Biden has actually gone way beyond that several times, which has prompted statements a day or two later. What the president meant to say was, so will he make a bold statement guaranteeing the defense of Taiwan? I don't think that's likely, but you never know. He's gone beyond the bounds of U.S. policy before. It'll be important to watch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll turn to Barbara in a second, but for Jen and Steve, the economy, both domestic and global, is hanging over everything. Inflation, particularly the price of energy, which has been up and down. How much will he talk about the economy as a thing to be done domestically and abroad, or will he talk more about the politics of these various things?
Well, the politics are really tricky because it's difficult to make the case that everything is getting better when the American people don't feel like everything is getting better. And the worst thing that you can do is appear tone deaf when people are still struggling to say, look, gas prices are down. Look, interest rates are going up but at a slower rate. Look, unemployment is at all-time lows, when people are still feeling this pinch. And so my sense is that because the politics aren't necessarily on his side, he's going to focus more on policies that continue to help the administration say that they can build a strong middle class. Mm-hmm.
And economic issues from a foreign policy perspective, one of the surprises, I think, of the first 2 years of the Biden administration is how much it has been a continuation of the Trump administration's trade policies, for example, particularly towards China. And there's a great deal of concern, especially in Europe, that some of the legislative achievements to promote green energy in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year, is pretty protectionist in nature in shutting out European partners from growing innovation sectors in the U.S. economy, and it's becoming quite a tense issue between us and the Europeans. I think it's popular. I think Biden has chosen this approach on trade policy because it plays so well to him. So I'm thinking that anything he says about our trade policy will keep those tensions high rather than reduce them.
Steve, one last question. Do people wait up overseas and watch this thing? I mean, it typically is at 9 o'clock at night,
Yeah.
right? You'll be in
I
Europe,
did.
that's like 4 in the morning.
I did, because serving as an ambassador overseas, you can bet that the day after the State of the Union, you're going to be on the morning talk shows talking about what it means for that particular country, as I did several times in Poland. But most foreign audiences don't stay up overnight to watch it.
It's not the Super Bowl.
No, they read about it in the newspaper the next day.
Barbara, anything in particular you're looking for when the president gives the remarks?
I am, Bill, and one item that we haven't talked about, which is both symbolic and substantive, and I don't know if the president will address it, and if so, how, but I think it's righting the ship of state after January the 6th, 2021, that he certainly should be given credit for that, and then connecting to his Philadelphia speech and going back to his announcement that he was running for president and citing Charlottesville, where we sit, and in August of 17, when the Nazis descended upon our fair city, he talked about saving the soul of America. And so I'm wondering if there's a way that he could talk about the election deniers and talk about democracy and the importance of elections and trusting in our system and trusting elections, and noticing that he didn't question whether Republicans really did take over and deserve to have the House of Representatives. So somewhere in those spaces, the soul of America, riding the ship of state after the insurrection of January the 6th, allowing for the other party to come to power in one of the houses, as symbolized and substantively manifested by having a Speaker of the House from the opposite party from him. I'm hoping there's a way to do that in a careful way that doesn't sound completely partisan, but that also signals to our partners around the world our ongoing belief in and faith in democracy.
Mm-hmm. To all three of you, any issues where you think he's going to reach out a hand to Republicans by indicating one of their priorities he's willing to talk about? Immigration, per se, right? Immigration's been largely an issue that Republicans have tried to campaign on, that there's a crisis at the border. And now you're even getting, watching the NewsHour last night, I think of NewsHour host is middle of the road. They affirmatively say there's a crisis at the border. Will he talk about immigration or other issues that Republicans tend to care about?
I don't think anybody would argue that there's not a crisis at the border. It's hard to imagine him talking about that in a way that isn't perceived as partisan when Kamala Harris is sitting up there and she literally was the recipient of a political stunt where, immigrants were shipped to her house, right? Or we think about Martha's Vineyard. It's very, very difficult, I think, given the way that the various sides, and especially the Republicans, have played immigration, right? Saying that they want a solution, but then not actually being in favor of bringing forward a solution. It becomes tricky. You can think back to 2006 when John McCain and Ted Kennedy and George Bush were all working together on this. And even though those leaders had a real, really supported the idea of a path to citizenship, they couldn't get their own sides on board. And we're far, far more fractured now. So, if he says anything about immigration, I think it's going to be very vague and amorphous.
Mm-hmm. Steve, any foreign policy issues that Republicans
I think
about?
trade is a natural thing where there's a convergence of views among mainstream Republicans and Democrats in the Congress. And so he'll want to play that up because it's an emerging unity moment. Again, that will hurt our relations a bit overseas, but it certainly won't be surprising to them.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, thoughts about how the president might or should or could reach out to the other side?
Well, it seems just beyond immigration.
Yeah. Other issues. Crime is something that's ping-pong back and forth. We had, during the election in 2020, the George Floyd killing took place. We've had this terrible recent police killing. The president, against some opposition in his own party, said that he was not for defunding the police. And yet Democrats in general have been sort of more progressive in leaning against crime. Will he raise that issue? Is there a way to do it in a bipartisan way?
I'm with Jen on this, that it's awfully hard to find anything that even objective observers would say, yes, well done, Mr. President, way to go. That was a bipartisan way to raise that. But given that the issues are, by their definitions these days, including policing and gun safety, all of those issues just tend to divide us, I think it's really difficult. But I think that that doesn't mean the president shouldn't try and use the language of come let us reason together. And Jen's mentioning of Ted Kennedy and John McCain coming together with George Bush, 43, on immigration. We were just saying yesterday about the Miller Center's oral history on Senator Kennedy, that when we released that in 2015 on Capitol Hill, that we had on the panel his good friend Alan Simpson, the conservative senator from Wyoming. And he said to us, boy, Ted could be as partisan as they come, and he could stab you in the back on the floor of the Senate, but behind the scenes, he would work with me on immigration. He would work with me on other projects. He would work with other Republicans across the aisle, and he said, here was the key to Ted. If he couldn't get the full loaf, he'd go for half the loaf. He'd even go for a quarter loaf. He might go for an eighth of a loaf, because he viewed it, given that he had 47 years in the Senate, he viewed it in the long term. So what could he get at the moment working across the aisle? The only way, though, that works, it seems to me, is when both parties want to do something. If you have one party that doesn't want to do anything in a space or has as its base anti-government, the government should get off our backs and do nothing, that's a problem.
One thing to add to that quickly is that the difference between this State of the Union and the last 2 years is that the Republicans now have an incentive to ensure that Joe Biden has no victories heading into the 2024 presidential election. The last 2 years, they wanted to be able to go back to their constituents for the 2022 midterms and say, look at what we got done, even though we were in the minority. So their incentive structure has changed, and it makes it far more difficult for anything that Joe Biden says to generate any sort of unified response.
Bill, I was just going to say we could add about the working across the aisle and come let us reason together. After the midterm elections, Mitch McConnell from my original home state of Kentucky shaking hands in northern Kentucky with President Biden about infrastructure, as Jen has mentioned, the importance of that for the new bridge to be built with federal infrastructure funds across the Ohio River from northern Kentucky to Cincinnati.
Quite literally building a bridge. So when we come back after this break, we'll look ahead at the ghosts of State of the Unions to come. Welcome back. Our final segment, we'll look at State of the Unions to come. So some of this is what happens after the State of the Union. The president will almost certainly have a line or two that he and his team wants to get repeated over. There will also be a response on the Republican side that will echo Republican themes. There will be the people in the gallery that they'll want to highlight and tell stories about. What are you looking for after the fact? Jen, why don't we start with you?
So the thing that's surprising me the most is that the response is going to be delivered by Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was the face of the Trump administration for a long time. And so if the Republicans are trying to move beyond Trump, and if they're thinking about the next election, which is where their sound bites would be used, and ideally used for them to juxtapose themselves to Joe Biden, it's somewhat strange to think that the spokesperson for them is going to be the person who is standing at the podium on behalf of Donald Trump. For the Trump team, I think this is generally a positive thing. It looks like his influence is still there. I'm not sure how positive it is for a party that wants to move beyond Trump. As far as Biden is concerned, he needs a couple of good lines that will get quoted over and over again. And basically the bar for the delivery of these States of the Union is low, right? They're long, they're generally a little bit whiny, they're winding. The New York Times used to print them in their entirety the next day. I don't know if they still do. It took up like the whole page in like tiny, tiny print. People aren't focused on all of the details. So a couple of good lines is really all it takes to have launched a successful speech. I think the juxtaposition between a future of Joe Biden and a future of Donald Trump embodied by Sarah Sanders is likely going to be part of the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Steve, how does this stuff play out overseas? Do they, the same kind of thing? Do they focus on a phrase, or is intentional or non-intentional, or do people dissect the speech in deep detail?
People generally, it depends where you sit, like with all things, right? So, for example, during my years as ambassador to Poland, there was a constant suspicion that somehow President Obama was giving Poland to the Russian sphere of influence, even though he might not have said anything about Europe or spheres of influence. Why didn't he talk about us in Poland? That's a sign that he's somehow not a trustworthy ally for us. I mentioned before in Indonesia, the war on terrorism is a war on Islam. And so local societies overseas tend to use, whenever the President of the United States speaks, that's by definition very important, and people try to use it to advance their political agenda, or to, if they have an axe to grind against the United States, they'll seize on something from the State of the Union that was not really intended for that purpose, but they'll use it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, what are you looking for in the weeks, months, and years after the State of the Union, and how this sets those things up?
Well, I hope I won't have my political science credentials revoked by saying this, but my favorite parts of the speech are before and after. And what I mean by that is when the president enters the House chamber, and I always get a little bit of a lump in my throat when the clerk or whatever of the sergeant at arms, you know, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States. And I recently
wrote...
Or
Madam Speaker.
Or Madam Speaker, exactly. But it will be Mr. is why I use that this time. So I had recently written this column where I said I had discovered the Fountain of Youth for Joe Biden, and it just so happened I had been invited as a member of the board of the White House Historical Association to a Christmas reception or holiday reception at the White House. And the President and the First Lady gave a brief remarks, and then they stepped down to this velvet rope where I was standing, and they started shaking hands. And the First Lady went through very quickly, because imagine having to do this every night in December, dress up and get your makeup on and go say hi to 600 people in your home. But the president took a moment with each and every person and chatted away, and his face just glowed. And I said 10 or 15 years just slipped off of him as he connected with people. So I view that opening as like the red carpet of the Oscars. I love to see the president come in and start going down the aisle and shaking hands. And then as he comes out, this is what I'll be watching for as well. His members of his party will be asking him to sign their copies, and he'll be shaking hands and glowing, I think. But what I'm looking for is that I keep hearing, even from people who support him, they worry about his age. They worry that he's 80 years old. They worry that he's not as sharp as he perhaps used to be. So one thing that he has to do is make sure he delivers, no matter what the wording is. He has to make sure that he delivers that speech smoothly and well, and doesn't seem to have an energy deficit as the hour plus goes by, and that he looks as sharp and fresh coming out on the red carpet as he did going in.
That's great. That's really great. Jen, back to you. There is obviously going to be coming out of this. You mentioned Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas, which her father once was, giving the response. She is an interesting face for the party. There's deep division in the party, right? It may not be perfectly divided in the middle of the party, but there are people that really want to get past President Trump, and people that really are living under the shadow of former President Trump. How do you think the Biden administration is going to play this out over the next 2 years, particularly with future State of the Unions as the benchmark for that?
Well, I think it's first important to highlight that there are two different types of division. So the first is there's the future of Trump versus the future not of Trump, which is a lot easier to find in the population than in the United States Congress, where right now, as far as I can tell, the only people who have actually articulated a preference for president have been those who have said they're backing Donald Trump already. The second division is within the Republican conference in Congress right now, where you've got the Matt Gaetz wing of the party, which is a very, very tiny wing, but when you have a very, very tiny majority, all you need is a tiny wing, trying to keep Kevin McCarthy from getting anything done unless he's willing to give them small little favors. So keeping Ilhan Omar off of the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday was a perfect example of this. We will know more and more over time what it is that Gates and Boebert have extracted. We're not going to know until we see these deals play out. But what that means for Joe Biden is for him to just continue to say things that unify the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi was excellent at making sure that the Democrats didn't air their dirty laundry in public. So far, it looks like Hakeem Jeffries is doing that as well. Joe Biden has to do that too, so that the Democrats can look like the adults in the room that are willing to put their differences aside on behalf of the American people. And he wants that narrative to continue to be about the divisions within the Republican Party, and how the divisions within the Republican Party about nuanced, often procedural details are keeping them from working on behalf of the American people. So I think if Joe Biden does talk about politics at all, it's going to be signaling that there's one party that cares about America and there's another party that cares about itself. And that's a difficult rebuttal to make for somebody like Sarah Sanders when she was the face of the Trump administration, but also when it's unclear exactly what language he's going to use.
Steve, as the world watches and has watched the progression of these State of the Unions, particularly the sometimes unified response of the Congress watching, sometimes only one party stands, do they think America's divisions continue to move in a direction of decline? Or do they feel like we've actually come together a bit after a period of deeper divisions?
I think we've recovered from a few years ago when the Trump administration made some radical shifts in foreign policy, publicly questioning the utility of NATO, even floating withdrawing the United States from NATO, rather unpredictable course on North Korea or Iran or other things. So I think especially the Ukraine crisis has given the United States a great platform to once again exercise global leadership, unifying our alliances behind us. But nevertheless, if we have repetitions of such examples from the past, you remember when Nancy Pelosi ripped up Donald Trump's speech very dramatically, or Joe
moment.
Wilson yelling, "You lied!" That doesn't help America's image overseas as a country that you can depend on through thick and thin. Again, the Ukraine crisis has given us a horrible catastrophe for the Ukrainian people, of course, but it helped the United States play a role once again that comforts the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add
please.
to the ambassador's point there, that one thing we haven't talked about, and this goes to your question, Bill, about how people see us, particularly abroad, but certainly at home, is that the other symbol of this is all three branches meeting under one roof in one chamber. And everybody who's had a civics class or an intro to American government class knows about our separation of powers as part of our constitutional structure, but political scientists over the years have said there are also shared powers. And so to have all three branches represented in some way, so to have Supreme Court justices, to have members of the House and the Senate, to have the president's cabinet there, the president himself, and the diplomatic corps, representatives from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the 4- and 5-star generals. And by the way, they typically don't applaud or not applaud. So the people who are meant to be apolitical, the military and usually the Supreme Court justices, I think that's all to the good as well. And that the president does have some, I think, some advantage over Congress. I just looked up approval ratings. You know, he's bouncing around in the low 40s, maybe at the highest, the mid 40s. The court usually is in the 50s or 60s, but we know that it has come crashing down into the 40 or lower % of approval. But Congress bounces into the teens, sometimes they're about 20% now. So he needs to use that, what seems like capital in approval ratings, but take advantage of that symbolism of all of our branches of government coming together.
Barbara, wonderfully seeing the glass half full here. Do we think that this tradition will continue? As you pointed out at the very beginning, you know, there was a long period in American history where we didn't do this kind of thing. Have the divisions become so deep that showing that off to the rest of the world is problematic? And that, you know, remember you mentioned the Supreme Court in one roof. There was a State of the Union address where President Obama, I think, pointed at the Citizens United decision And Chief Justice, or not Chief Justice, Associate Justice Alito said that's not true, or
Very mouthed, not true. And in fact, President Obama's description of the Citizens United case was not 100% accurate, but still, that was a very unusual situation. And I certainly got lots of calls from the media about it. And that's what's unfortunate when that becomes the narrative the day after.
Do we expect that either in this State of the Union or in the future, the Boeberts, Gates, Marjorie Taylor Greens are going to shout out "You lie" or seek a moment in the sun?
Can they seek any more moments than they've sought? I mean, I don't think they need to make a name for themselves at this point. I think the more likely sort of unsettling thing that could happen is when the president talks about reproductive rights and the extent to which Congress might be in a position to codify or not codify Roe. And you've got a Supreme Court there that is heavily divided, that we know has taken a hit because of the leak regarding that decision. I think that that's a potential moment where, when the cameras look at the court, we might expect, we might be looking to read the tea leaves. Look, the networks are going to show Matt Gaetz, they're going to show Lauren Boebert, they're going to show Marjorie Taylor Greene, because they're waiting for them to behave badly. I think it's probably unlikely that they're going to behave badly, just because they want to look like they're reasonable, and they want to look like the compromises that they've struck with Kevin McCarthy were not, terrorist attacks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left. Lightning round, 1 minute each of you of not just a closing thought, but something that makes you optimistic about the State of the Union. And if you don't feel optimistic, why?
Oh, am I going first?
Yeah.
I think that even when the fact that the State of the Union address happens, even during the darkest days of the Trump administration, the fact that the administration knew the importance of going and delivering this address means that there is this underlying degree of accountability. And even when people behave badly, even when it seems quite controversial, even when there's not unified thought coming out of the address, there is the sense that this is how a government is held accountable by the people. And through thick and thin, during the Trump administration, following 9/11, following January 6th, we've still done it. And so I believe that we're probably going to continue to do it. It might become a more and more partisan speech, and there might become more and more dysfunction within the chamber, but it signals to the American people that the government is alive and well.
Steve?
I think the State of the Union is a snapshot of what our whole politics, what our whole society is like. Just as popular politics has veered from substance heavy to being more performative, so too has the State of the Union. And so whatever the state of health of our union is, that State of the Union speech is a great picture of where we stand right now, all the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's got to continue. It's required in the Constitution. I can't imagine any president or Congress would not want, even if it's completely performance art at this stage, it's still an important thing to do. And it is this, even if people are squabbling or screaming out "you lie" or ripping up each other's speeches, it does bring the entire U.S. government together under one roof, and it's an important opportunity of showing America's face to the world and laying out what our most important priorities are. And so it's really important. Of course it's going to stick around.
Barbara?
My positive note is a religious analogy, and that is, many people talk about our institutions as our government institutions as our civic religion. And so to me, that chamber is sacred. The Capitol is sacred, the court is sacred, the White House is sacred in that civic religion sort of way. And so even if church attendance begins to fall, or people note that in formal religion, people aren't attending so much anymore, particularly after the pandemic, there's always that, where one or two are gathered in the name, there we are. And so I think that that's how I view it, is that we must continue to do this. And as the ambassador said, it is symbolic of and substantively proves the rule of law. This is required, the actual report is required, but rather than just have it read, have as many people gathered together to see that we can come together in some way.
That's great. Well, my last optimistic thought is that this is the 50th anniversary of the first joint address of Congress that Joe Biden attended as an elected representative. It was not a State of the Union that year because Richard Nixon had just been re-elected and re-inaugurated. And that he's going to be delivering this address and probably finishing it well past not only his bedtime, but my bedtime. And if he can stay up and do that, I think that that speaks well for the country. So thank you all for joining us for this discussion, and most importantly, thank to my terrific colleagues, not just for being here today, but all that you do for the University of Virginia and for the Miller Center.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.